The morning of October 15th started like any other Tuesday, except for the weight in my chest that I couldn't shake. My name is Marcus Kane, and for 37 years, I've lived two lives that nobody, not even my wife Sarah or my 12-year-old son David, could ever know about. To them, I was simply Captain Marcus Kane, commercial airline pilot for Atlantic Airways. Gray hair that had grown longer than regulation allowed, laugh lines around my eyes from years of reassuring nervous passengers, and hands steady enough to land a 747 in a thunderstorm. But beneath that uniform lived someone else entirely, Agent 47 Delta, a ghost who moved through shadows for reasons that would die with me. That Tuesday morning, Sarah was humming in the kitchen, her auburn hair catching the early sunlight as she packed David's lunch. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with her lavender perfume created that familiar comfort I'd grown to treasure during my brief moments home. "Dad, you promised we'd go to the Yankees game when you get back," David said, not looking up from his cereal. His voice carried that particular tone kids use when they're trying not to sound disappointed but failing miserably. I ruffled his dark hair, so much like mine before the gray took over. 2 weeks, buddy. I'll be back from this route and we'll get those seats behind home plate." Sarah kissed my cheek, her lips warm against my skin. "Be safe up there, Marcus. Something feels different about this trip." She always had that intuition. 20 years of marriage had given her an almost supernatural ability to sense when my pilot routes weren't exactly what they seemed. But she never asked questions, and I never offered answers. It was our unspoken agreement, the foundation that kept our family intact while I balanced on the razor's edge between two worlds. The drive to JFK felt longer than usual. October in New York painted everything in shades of amber and rust. But today the colors seemed muted, as if someone had turned down the saturation on the world itself. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary as I reviewed the mission parameters one final time. The Statue of Liberty wasn't just a tourist destination for me that day. Hidden within Lady Liberty's crown was a dead drop that contained intelligence crucial to preventing something catastrophic, something that would make 9/11 look like a minor incident. My contact, known only as Prometheus, had been feeding information about a terrorist cell planning to hijack multiple aircraft simultaneously across the East Coast. But Prometheus had gone silent 3 weeks ago. As I parked near Battery Park, the October wind carried the scent of salt water and something else, something that made my trained instincts scream danger. The ferry to Liberty Island was crowded with tourists, their cameras clicking constantly, their voices a mixture of excitement and awe. I blended in perfectly. Just another middle-aged man with slightly too long gray hair, wearing a navy jacket and carrying a small backpack. The statue loomed larger as we approached, her torch raised against a sky that seemed unusually gray for midday. I'd visited her dozens of times as a child, but never like this, never knowing that within her copper walls lay secrets that could save or destroy thousands of lives. Once on the island, I separated from the tour groups using techniques learned over 15 years of covert operations. The Crown access was limited, requiring advance reservations, but Agent 47 Delta had ways around such restrictions. A carefully placed phone call, a forged maintenance credential, and suddenly, I had legitimate access to areas most visitors would never see. Inside the statue's head, the narrow spiral staircase felt like climbing through the spine of some ancient creature. My breathing was controlled, professional, but my heart rate had increased. Something was wrong. The dead drop location, a small cavity behind the 7th rivet from Lady Liberty's left eye, should have contained a micro SD card with the terrorist cell's complete operational plan. Instead, I found a note written in Prometheus's distinctive handwriting. "They know. Trust no one. The sky will burn unless you disappear. Your family depends on it." The words hit me like a physical blow. In 15 years of operations, I'd never had my cover compromised. But somehow someone had connected Captain Marcus Kane to Agent 47 Delta. The implications crashed over me like a tsunami. Sarah making breakfast that morning, David asking about the baseball game, both of them living normal lives while a target had been painted on our entire family. My secure phone buzzed once, a text from an unknown number. "Beautiful view from the Crown. Your wife looks lovely in lavender. Your son's school lets out at 3:15. They weren't just watching me. They were watching my family. Right now." The phone buzzed again. "Disappear completely or they disappear permanently. You have 1 hour to become a ghost." Standing in the crown of the Statue of Liberty, surrounded by the symbols of freedom and hope, I realized I had no choice. To save Sarah and David, Marcus Kane, pilot, husband, father, had to die today. But Agent 47 Delta would find a way to survive, and someday, somehow, I would find a way back to them. The last thing I did before vanishing was look out through Lady Liberty's eyes at the city where my family lived, memorizing every detail of the skyline, knowing it might be years before I saw it again. 5 years, 1,826 days since I watched the New York skyline disappear behind me as I became a ghost. The man who kissed Sarah goodbye that morning and promised David a Yankees game was officially declared dead after 6 months of fruitless searching. Captain Marcus Kane's body was never found, lost somewhere in the waters around Liberty Island according to the official report. But Agent 47 Delta learned to survive in the shadows of Eastern Europe, moving through safe houses in Prague, Budapest, and Warsaw. I grew my gray hair longer, let my beard grow wild, and became someone even I didn't recognize in mirrors. The terrorist cell that had threatened my family was dismantled piece by piece over 3 years of careful, methodical work. Each member eliminated or captured, their network destroyed from within, yet I remained dead to the world I loved. The hardest part wasn't the physical isolation or the constant danger. It was the silence. No phone calls, no letters, no way to know if Sarah had moved on, if David still remembered the father who never came home from his last flight. I survived on fragments, newspaper clippings found in internet cafes, social media photos glimpsed over strangers' shoulders, anything that might show me glimpses of their lives. In year 3, I found a photo online from David's high school graduation. He'd grown tall, his shoulders broad like mine, but his eyes carried a sadness that cut through me like a blade. Sarah stood beside him in a blue dress I'd never seen, her smile brave but hollow. They were surviving without me, but they weren't living. That's when I began planning my resurrection. The problem was simple. Marcus Kane was dead, legally and officially. His bank accounts closed, his pilot's license revoked, his entire existence erased from every system that mattered. But I'd spent 5 years learning how to manipulate technology in ways that would have seemed impossible to the simple airline pilot I used to be. The solution came to me during a cold Prague winter, watching people line up at ATMs outside a bank. These machines were connected to networks, but they were also isolated enough to be vulnerable to someone with the right skills and equipment. More importantly, they were places my family might visit, places where a message could appear without warning, without explanation. I spent months studying the banking systems around New York, identifying the specific ATM that Sarah used most frequently, the one outside the grocery store where she shopped every Thursday, the same store where we used to buy David's favorite cereal, where she still bought it according to the receipts I'd glimpsed through carefully hacked security cameras. The technical challenge was enormous. I needed to insert a message into the ATM's display system without triggering security protocols, without leaving digital fingerprints that could be traced back to me. It required hardware. I built myself in a Warsaw basement, software I coded during sleepless nights, and timing that had to be perfect down to the second. But the emotional challenge was even greater. What do you say to a family that's mourned you for 5 years? How do you announce that you're alive without explaining why you had to die? How do you prove it's really you without putting them in danger again? The message had to be simple, unmistakable, and impossible to fake. 2 words that only Marcus Kane would use, in a context that only Sarah would understand. I am here. Portuguese for I'm here. The phrase I whispered to her every night before falling asleep during our honeymoon in Brazil, when she was afraid of the unfamiliar sounds outside our hotel window. The phrase I said to David when he had nightmares, when he needed to know his father was close. 2 words that carried 20 years of love, protection, and promises. On a Thursday in October, exactly 5 years after my disappearance, I positioned myself 3 blocks away from that grocery store ATM, my fingers trembling over a modified tablet that would send the signal. Sarah's routine hadn't changed. She still shopped on Thursdays, still used the same ATM, still wore that small gold bracelet I'd given her for our 10th anniversary. Through a telephoto lens, I watched her approach the machine. Older now, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before but still beautiful in that way that made my chest ache with longing. She inserted her card, entered her PIN, and selected her transaction. That's when my message appeared on the screen. I watched her face change from confusion to shock to something that might have been hope. She stared at those two words for a full minute, her hand covering her mouth, her body trembling. Then she looked around frantically, as if she might see me standing there, as if 5 years of grief might suddenly make sense. She printed her receipt and ran to her car, the message burning in her mind like a brand. The first phase of my return had begun, but I knew that appearing on an ATM screen was just the beginning. Sarah would need proof, David would need answers, and I would need to find a way to explain 5 years of silence without revealing the truth that could still destroy us all. From my position 3 blocks away, I watched her drive home, probably to tell David about the impossible message from a dead man. Tomorrow, I would take the next step in a plan that would either reunite my family or destroy what little peace they'd managed to build without me. The ghost was ready to become human again. The message on the ATM screen haunted Sarah for 3 days. I knew because I'd been watching, not like a stalker, but like a man desperate to understand the lives that had continued without him. She'd driven past that same ATM twice more, as if hoping the words might appear again, as if she could somehow reach through the screen and pull me back into existence. David noticed his mother's strange behavior immediately. At 17, he'd inherited my ability to read people, to sense when something fundamental had shifted in the world around him. I watched them through carefully positioned surveillance equipment as they sat at our old kitchen table, the same one where I'd promised him that Yankees game 5 years ago. "Mom, you've been acting weird since Thursday," David said, his voice deeper now, carrying the weight of someone who'd grown up too fast. "What happened at the store?" Sarah's hands shook as she poured coffee into the mug I'd bought her in Seattle, a lifetime ago when I was just a pilot who flew routes and came home to dinner. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just, sometimes I think I see things that remind me of your father." But David was too smart, too observant. "This is different. You look like you've seen a ghost." If only he knew how accurate that statement was. I'd spent those 3 days finalizing the next phase of my plan. The ATM message was just the opening move in a complex game of revelation. Sarah needed more proof, something undeniable, something that would convince her she wasn't losing her mind. But it had to be delivered in a way that wouldn't trigger the security protocols I'd spent 5 years learning to navigate. The answer came from an unexpected source: David's social media activity. My son had become quite the photographer, posting images on Instagram that showed a real artistic eye. Landscapes, street photography, candid shots of friends. But what caught my attention was a photo he'd posted of the sunset from our old apartment's fire escape. The same fire escape where I used to sit with him when he was small, teaching him to identify different aircraft by their engine sounds. The metadata on that photo told me everything I needed to know about his current location, his routines, his digital footprint. More importantly, it gave me an idea for the next contact. David had a habit of checking his phone obsessively like most teenagers, but unlike most teenagers, he was also technically gifted, something he'd inherited from me, though he didn't know about my more advanced skills. He'd built his own computer, learned basic programming, even dabbled in cybersecurity as a hobby. That made him the perfect recipient for my next message. On Sunday evening, while David was in his room supposedly doing homework but actually editing photos, I initiated a carefully crafted digital intrusion. Not a hack, nothing that would trigger security systems or leave traces. Instead, I used a technique I'd perfected in Prague, a ghost message that would appear to come from within his own system. The message appeared as a notification on his desktop computer. "Photo upload complete. Dad, Yankees promise JPG." But there was no photo. When David clicked on the notification, it opened a simple text file containing a single line. Section 127, row 15, seats 7, 8. I remember my promise. Those were the exact seats I'd planned to buy for the Yankees game we never attended. Section 127, row 15, seats 7 and 8, behind home plate. Just like I'd promised. Information that only Marcus Kane would know. Details that had never been written down anywhere. Never shared with anyone except David during that last breakfast 5 years ago. I watched through his webcam as my son's face went through the same transformation I'd seen in Sarah 3 days earlier. Confusion, disbelief, then a dawning recognition that made his hands shake as he stared at the screen. "Mom!" His voice cracked as he called down the hallway. "Mom, you need to see this!" Sarah appeared in his doorway within seconds, still wearing the lavender perfume that had become my anchor to home during 5 years of exile. When David showed her the message, when he explained about the Yankees seats and the promise his father had made, I watched 20 years of marriage and 5 years of grief collide in her expression. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. "Your father is dead, I know. But Mom, nobody else knew about those seats. Nobody else knew about that promise. It was just between me and Dad. That last morning before he—" David's voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that had defined their lives for 5 years. Sarah sat on the edge of his bed, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The ATM message. "Estu aquí." And now this. "David, what if he's alive?" David finished the question she couldn't ask. What if Dad didn't die in that accident? What if he's been trying to tell us something? I had to look away from the screen. Watching them piece together the impossible truth was both exactly what I'd hoped for and more painful than I'd anticipated. They were beginning to believe, beginning to hope, but they still had no idea why I'd had to disappear or what it had cost me to stay away. The next phase would be the most dangerous. I needed to arrange a meeting, a real reunion, but it had to be in a place where I could control every variable, where I could ensure their safety while finally explaining 5 years of silence. But first, I had one more message to send. This time, it would tell them exactly where to find me. From my position in a rented apartment 6 miles away, I began typing the coordinates that would bring my family back to me, or destroy us all in the attempt. The coordinates I sent led to a place that held 20 years of memories. Riverside Park, near the bench where I'd proposed to Sarah on a snowy December evening in 2003. The message appeared on both their phones simultaneously at exactly 9:47 p.m., a timestamp that corresponded to the moment I'd gotten down on one knee and asked her to marry a man whose deepest secrets she'd never know. Riverside Park, bench 47. Tomorrow, 6 p.m. Come alone, both of you. Trust no one else with this information. M. I watched through their apartment window as they stared at their phones, the weight of decision settling over them like a heavy blanket. Sarah paced the living room while David sat motionless, his 17-year-old mind trying to process the impossible possibility that his father might be alive. "It could be someone playing a cruel joke," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Someone who knew your father, who knew about our private moments." David shook his head. "The Yankees seats, Mom. The Portuguese phrase. The proposal bench number. Nobody else knew all of that. Nobody. I spent that night in a hotel room 12 blocks from the park, staring at surveillance footage of the bench where I'd asked Sarah to build a life with me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was about to risk everything we'd built by revealing I was alive, potentially putting them in the same danger that had forced me to disappear in the first place. But 5 years of intelligence work had taught me something crucial. The terrorist cell that had threatened my family was completely dismantled. Their leader, a man known only as the Architect, had been captured in a joint operation between 3 intelligence agencies. The network that had forced Marcus Kane to die was nothing but scattered remnants now, powerless and broken. It was safe to come home. Finally, it was safe. The next evening arrived with the kind of October chill that made New York feel like a city holding its breath. I positioned myself behind a cluster of oak trees 50 yards from bench 47, watching every approach, every shadow, every person who entered the park. Old habits from 5 years of staying alive in hostile territory. At 5:55 p.m., I saw them walking together down the path. Sarah wore the blue coat I'd bought her for Christmas 4 years before my disappearance. She'd kept it all this time. David had grown so tall he was nearly my height now, his shoulders broad, his walk confident despite the uncertainty that must have been eating at him. They sat on the bench and waited. Sarah's hands were folded in her lap, the same way she used to sit during David's little league games when she was nervous about his performance. David kept checking his phone, then scanning the park, his eyes moving with a systematic pattern that reminded me painfully of myself. At exactly 6:00 p.m., I stepped out from behind the trees. The distance between us was maybe 30 yards, but it felt like crossing an ocean. Every step brought me closer to the life I'd been forced to abandon, closer to the family that had mourned me, closer to explanations I wasn't sure I could give. Sarah saw me first. Her hand flew to her mouth and she made a sound, half gasp, half sob, that carried across the evening air like a physical blow. David's head snapped up, following her gaze, and I watched my son's face transform as he recognized the man he'd buried 5 years ago. "Dad?" The word came out as barely a whisper, but in the quiet of the park it sounded like thunder. I stopped walking when I was 10 feet away, close enough to see the tears starting in Sarah's eyes, close enough to see that David had inherited the same gray eyes that looked back at me from mirrors, close enough to see 5 years of grief and confusion and desperate hope written across both their faces. "Hello, Sarah. Hello, David." My voice was rougher than it used to be, weathered by years of speaking different languages, of being different people. "I know you have questions." Sarah stood up slowly, as if sudden movements might make me disappear again. "You're supposed to be dead. We had a memorial service. We buried an empty coffin. I've been wearing black for 5 years, Marcus. I know, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." David stood beside his mother, his hands clenched into fists. "Where have you been? Do you have any idea what you put us through? Mom cried herself to sleep for 2 years. 2 years, Dad." The anger in his voice was justified, and it cut deeper than any physical wound I'd sustained during my years in exile. I had to disappear. There were people who wanted to hurt you, hurt both of you, because of work I was doing. The only way to keep you safe was to make Marcus Kane disappear completely. "What kind of work?" Sarah's voice was steady now, but I could see her hands shaking. "You were a pilot. You flew commercial routes. This was the moment I'd dreaded for 5 years. The moment when I had to choose between the truth that might destroy us and the lies that had already cost us so much. I was more than a pilot, Sarah. I was working for people who needed someone with my skills, someone who could move freely around the world without suspicion. And eventually that work put a target on our family." David stepped closer, his eyes searching my face for deception. "Are you saying you were some kind of spy?" "I'm saying I was someone who made enemies. And those enemies threatened to hurt the 2 people I love most in the world unless I disappeared forever." Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face as 20 years of marriage collided with 5 years of grief. "You could have told us. You could have trusted us. And put you in more danger." "Sarah, they knew where David went to school. They knew what time you left for work. They knew everything about our lives. And they were willing to use that knowledge to destroy you." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. 5 years of separation, 5 years of secrets, 5 years of a family torn apart by choices I'd made to keep them alive. Finally, David spoke. "Are we safe now? Is that why you're back?" "Yes. The people who threatened you are gone. All of them. It took 5 years, but they can never hurt you again." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. 5 years, Marcus. 5 years of thinking you were dead. Do you have any idea how that changes a person? I did know. I could see it in the lines around her eyes, in the way she held herself, in the careful distance she maintained even now. The woman I'd married was still there, but she'd been transformed by grief into someone stronger and more fragile at the same time. "I know I can't undo those 5 years," I said. "I know I can't give you back the time we lost. But I'm here now, and I'm never leaving again." David looked at his mother, then back at me. "What happens now? Do we just go home? Pretend the last 5 years didn't happen? We figure it out together," I said. "All of us. One day at a time." Sarah took a step closer, close enough that I could smell her lavender perfume, close enough to see the gold bracelet still on her wrist. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Marcus. I don't know if I can trust you not to disappear again. I understand. I'll spend the rest of my life earning that trust back." As the sun set behind the New York skyline, my family and I sat on the bench where our life together had begun, trying to figure out how to rebuild what 5 years of necessary lies had broken. The ghost had become human again. Now I had to learn how to be a husband and father once more. 3 months after that evening in Riverside Park, I was learning that resurrection is more complicated than death. The legal process of bringing Marcus Kane back from the dead required lawyers, government officials, and explanations that danced carefully around classified truths. My former handler at the agency helped smooth the bureaucratic obstacles, citing national security operations that couldn't be disclosed publicly. But the real challenge wasn't legal. It was learning how to be a family again. Sarah had insisted I move into the guest room initially. "I need time," she'd said, and I understood. You can't mourn someone for 5 years and then simply resume a marriage as if nothing happened. Trust, once shattered, doesn't heal overnight. David's reaction was more complex. Part of him was angry, furious at the years of believing his father was dead, at the graduation I'd missed, at the nights he'd needed guidance I couldn't provide. But another part of him was fascinated by the truth about my double life, by the skills I'd developed, by the stories I could finally tell. "So when you said you were flying to Chicago," he asked one evening as we sat in the kitchen, "you were actually in Prague?" "Sometimes. Other times I really was flying to Chicago. The pilot job was real, David. It was just not the only job." Sarah listened from the doorway, still processing the revelation that the man she'd married had been living a double life for most of their relationship. How much of our marriage was real, Marcus? How much of the man I fell in love with actually existed? It was the question I dreaded most, because the answer was complicated. "All of it," I said. "Every moment we shared, every conversation, every time I told you I loved you, that was real." Marcus Kane, the husband and father, was never a cover identity, Sarah. He was the most real part of me. The breakthrough came on a snowy December evening, almost exactly 20 years after I'd proposed on that park bench. I was in the kitchen making dinner, a skill I'd perfected during 5 years of living alone, when David walked in carrying a wrapped package. "I found this in the back of my closet," he said, setting it on the counter. "Mom saved it all these years. It was the Christmas present I'd bought for him the year I disappeared. A vintage Yankees jersey, Derek Jeter's #2, that I'd planned to give him along with tickets to that promised game." Sarah had wrapped it and hidden it away, unable to throw it out, but unable to look at it either. "I thought maybe—" David's voice cracked slightly. "Maybe we could finally go to that game, if you still want to." I looked at my son, 17 years old now, nearly a man, but still carrying the hope of the 12-year-old boy who'd believed his father's promises. Section 127, row 15, seats 7 and 8. "If they're still available." Sarah appeared in the doorway, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The season doesn't start for 4 months. Then we'll wait," I said. I've gotten good at waiting. That night, Sarah knocked on the guest room door. When I opened it, she was holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression she used to get when she'd made a difficult decision. "I've been thinking," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed, "about forgiveness, about trust, about what it means to love someone who's capable of disappearing for 5 years to protect you." I waited, afraid to speak, afraid to hope. "I'm not ready to pretend the last 5 years didn't happen," she continued. "I'm not ready to go back to the way things were, but maybe we can figure out how to move forward." "What does that look like?" "It looks like you sleeping in our bedroom again. It looks like family dinners and honest conversations and learning how to trust each other again. It looks like you keeping your promise to take David to that baseball game. And if I have to travel for work? If the agency needs me for something?" Sarah's smile was sad but genuine. "Then you tell me the truth about where you're going and when you'll be back. No more lies, Marcus. No more secrets. If we're going to do this, we do it with complete honesty, even if the truth is dangerous. Especially then, I'd rather live with the truth and the fear than live with lies and false security." 6 weeks later, on a cold February morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror getting ready for my first day back at Atlantic Airways. The airline had been surprisingly accommodating about rehiring a pilot who'd been legally dead for 5 years, especially after some carefully placed phone calls from my former handler. My hair was shorter now, more regulation, but still gray. The lines around my eyes were deeper, carved by 5 years of living in shadows. But for the first time in half a decade, the man looking back at me from the mirror was completely, authentically Marcus Kane. "Dad?" David appeared in the doorway, dressed for school. "I wanted to give you something before you left." He handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a photo he'd taken and printed himself, a picture of our family from that first dinner after my return. Sarah was laughing at something I'd said. David was rolling his eyes in mock embarrassment, and I was smiling with an expression of pure contentment. "For your wallet," David said. "So, you remember what you're coming home to." As I drove to JFK that morning, the photo tucked safely in my wallet next to my pilot's license, I thought about the strange mathematics of love and sacrifice. 5 years of separation to ensure a lifetime of safety. 5 years of being dead so that the people I loved could truly live. The radio crackled as I taxied toward the runway for my first flight in 5 years. "Atlantic 447, you are cleared for takeoff." "Atlantic 447, cleared for takeoff," I responded, my hands steady on the controls, my voice calm and professional. But this time, as the aircraft lifted off from New York and climbed toward the clouds, I knew exactly where I was going and exactly where I would return. The ghost had finally found his way home, and Marcus Kane, pilot, husband, father, was ready to fly again. That evening, I would walk through my front door to the smell of Sarah's cooking and the sound of David's laughter. I would kiss my wife and help my son with his homework and fall asleep in my own bed, next to the woman who'd waited 5 years for a dead man to come home. And in 4 months, when baseball season started, David and I would finally make it to Section 127, Row 15, Seats 7 and 8, where a father would keep a promise that had taken 5 years to fulfill. Some stories end with death. This one ended with resurrection, with the understanding that love is stronger than fear, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning how to come home.